Welcome to Jason Sports, the Detroit Lions News Podcast on the Jason Sports YouTube page. We're going to be talking about the Detroit Lions today because I go on Twitter, or X as it's called now, and I see a lot of people talking about the Lions and how they missed an opportunity. They need to be like the Eagles, and they bring up the Myles Garrett situation. They bring up guys like of that ilk, Myles Garrett, Khalil Mack, and all that jazz. And I don't disagree with you one bit. I did a video earlier last week about getting Myles Garrett and how it would make sense, and I went on both sides of it, and I said, look, you could be on both sides of the coin. You really can, because there's two sides to everything. There's not just one answer. I mean, I think the one thing we learned about the Detroit Lions yesterday is they do have the talent to compete with the Philadelphia Eagles. Unfortunately for the Detroit Lions, a lot of their talent was on the IR. When you lose guys like Hutchinson or McNeil or Carlton Davis, it's going to hurt. It really is. But when you lose a lot of depth, that's when it really starts to hurt and it really starts to multiply. And when you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, this is just a quick breakdown of what the Eagles spend on offense and defense, and compared to the Detroit Lions on offense and defense. So as you see, the Lions offense, they spend $107.8 million. The offense for the Philadelphia Eagles spent 101.8. That number will change next year. So this is this year's statistics, and as you can see, both nearly spend the same thing in defense. The difference is I think the Eagles spend more on special teams than the Detroit Lions, but that's because they got Jake Elliott, and he's a pretty good kicker. But it was interesting because Jeremy Risen posted this today, Detroit Online. He says Eagles defensive line, how they acquired him. Nolan Smith was drafted in the first round. Jalen Carter was drafted in the first round. Jordan Davis was drafted in the first round. Brandon Graham was drafted in the first round. Josh Sweat was drafted in the fourth round. So yeah, F them picks. And I see what they're saying because you can go back on it and you could talk about let's trade for Myles Garrett. Okay, that's perfect. You should want to go out and get the best guys. I totally agree with it. I'm not disputing that or nothing of that ilk. But the one thing you should learn about the Philadelphia Eagles yesterday wasn't that they had anyone above that defense that was making over $8.5 million. Just think about that for a minute. Their defensive line was so dominant, and they didn't have anyone over $8.5 million. And I will hamper you back to last year when the Philadelphia Eagles had Hassan Reddick. They traded him to New York, where he held out for most of the year, and they said, "Screw that, we're not paying him the money," and they didn't. And they put that money around, Chauncey Gardner Johnson, Darius Slay. They got some good picks. We all know that the Detroit Lions defense needs to be better. And a lot of people coming out of the woodwork saying, "Oh, they need to focus on the defense." They have focused on the defense. Getting Hutchinson was a huge one. Makai Wingo from last year is going to be a good pick in my eyes. Ali McNeil was a great pick. Derek Barnes, Malcolm Rodriguez, those guys. Unfortunately, you just couldn't stay healthy. And like I look back at this was when I did the podcast a couple weeks ago. I said, the Lions ended the season with 16 players on IR. This was Derek Barnes, Carlton Davis, Malcolm Rodriguez, Aiden Hutchinson. But if you go a step further, these were guys that missed 3+ games or end the season injured. And look at the defensive line: Davenport, Pascal, Pat O'Connor, Makai Wingo, Kyle Pecco, John Kaminsky, Broderick Barton. Look, I'm not saying that you have to go out and get a guy like Myles Garrett. Getting a guy like Myles Garrett is totally is the right way to, he's a good player. He's a Hall of Fame player. You should want to get a guy like that. But if you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, it wasn't because they had a star defensive lineman. Jalen Carter is obviously becoming a star, but you've seen the reason that they did so well yesterday was the depth. And it also spoke to how bad the Kansas City Chiefs offensive line was. And I heard something from Booger McFarland on the ESPN broadcast after the game, and he was saying when you take a guy like Joe Thuney, who is their guard, and you put him out the tackle, because that's what they did at the end of the year. They put him out the tackle. The left guard was the second string guard, and you're putting the second string guard against Jalen Carter and those guys in the middle. It's not going to be a good day. So the Eagles had the perfect matchup to exploit. It pure and simple. It was the perfect matchup for a good defensive line to exploit. They got the guys, they got the depth, and they got the guys that could beat the depth of the Kansas City Chiefs, which is not a good offensive line. It wasn't all year. Patrick Mahomes was doing things that, I mean, some of the things he was doing this year was unbelievable because that offensive line was terrible. And you look at what the Eagles did yesterday. The Eagles just played the way that they played. I mean, we all knew the Eagles were good. It didn't take a anyone it didn't take a oh shit moment to say, "Oh, the Eagles defensive line is good." I said a couple months ago when they were playing the Buffalo Bills, they lost. They lost with Lee McNeil and they lost Carlton Davis. I said this at that point in time. And it wasn't holding myself, from the Super Bowl expectations. I just looked at it realistically. I said, "There's no way this Lions team is going to win the Super Bowl." I posted this the day after the Eagles. I mean, the day of when McNeil and Davis were out indefinitely. The Super Bowl dream is dead. And it's a battle of attrition. You've seen the Eagles; they didn't really have that many injuries. You saw the Eagles really play a good game, but it was partly because they were so healthy and they had the perfect matchup to go against. The Kansas City Chiefs didn't have anyone on that offensive line that could really block. I mean, Jawan Taylor, he's been a massive bust. Trey Smith and Creed Humphrey, they're good, but when you give a guy like Vic Fangio an offensive line that got some major holes in it, he will take advantage of it. And I just look at it like this: the Lions do stack up with the Eagles in a bunch of ways. And I'll say it like this: the Lions have a run game, the Eagles have a run game. I would say those are the two best run games in the NFL. Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Dave Montgomery. It's a great rushing game. And that's how they got their bread and butter. Both the Eagles and the Lions are great on the offensive line. They both have two really good wide receivers in Devontae Smith for the Eagles and A.J. Brown, and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams for the Detroit Lions. Both have good tight ends, Sam Laporta, Dallas Goedert. Both have good quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts and Jared Goff. Here's where the separator is. The Eagles have more depth on their defensive line. I think the Lions linebackers are really good. I think the Lions cornerbacks, it's questionable where they are right now. Obviously, it's hard to really grasp where Terrion Arnold is in his development, and trying to compare him to Quinyon Mitchell is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because those guys had a healthy defensive line the whole year. It just comes down to health. It really does. A lot of people, they want to sit here and they want to talk about, oh, the Eagles, look at them and look at Quinyon Mitchell. Let's look at Cooper DeJean. Guys, the reason that they were like that was because of that defensive line. And obviously, we couldn't get the good decipher of what the Detroit Lions really were, because by the sixth game of the season, Hutch was gone. And then you had players just dropping like flies. And you never really got a good glimpse of what your defense could potentially be. Kaminsky was lost before training camp. You had Marcus Davenport drop in the third game. It just never really worked. So when people say the Lions should learn from the Eagles, the first thing the Lions should learn is try to avoid injury, because this year was a horrible year for injuries. They played well. They got to 15-2, but I heard someone say yesterday, "Oh, they're never going to have 15 wins again." No shit. No shit. You could be a better team and have a worse record. 15-2 means nothing when you get shelled in the playoffs. And this is what I said going into the Commanders game. I told you that you would have to play perfect football to win that game. I told you that. You can go back and check the tape. I told you that if you didn't play perfect football, Jane Daniels would make you pay, because he did. And it comes to a point where talent just wins out. And when you don't have the talent because half your defense is on IR, it's kind of tough to stand up to the best offenses, and it's kind of tough to ask your offense every game to score 40 points a game. That's what the Detroit Lions had to do, and it just didn't work. In the end of the day, it didn't work, and we saw why it didn't work. And maybe it was a good thing the Lions lost to the Eagles. The lost to the Commanders, because if they would have played the Eagles with the defensive injuries the Lions had, with the way that the Eagles defense was playing, it would have been game over. Period. End of story. Because there's no way you can go against a healthy team with the depleted team. That's just literally what it came down to. If you're any fan of sports, if you're any fan of, baseball or football or hockey or basketball, every year the championship is won by the team that stays the healthiest. That's literally the way it goes. And the Lions were a talented team this year. There's no doubt about it. They were one of the more talented teams in the NFL. But the reality of the situation is when it all came down to the nuts and bolts of, are you talented enough to win a Super Bowl in the playoffs? The Lions weren't because of injuries. So what the Lions have to do with this offseason, in my opinion, they got to go get depth. They really do. I think Mekhi Wingo is a really good depth piece. I don't know if Kaminsky will be back, but getting some edge help would be necessary. Marcus Davenport, I thought he did a pretty damn good job for the first 2 games, but the guy has shown a inability to stay healthy. So it's someone to go get. But does the offseason hinge on getting Myles Garrett or Khalil Mack? No, because the Eagles just showed you yesterday. Not one of their players is making over $8.5 million. Not one. The difference with the Eagles in comparison with the Lions defensive line, they have more depth, a lot more depth. And if you're Brad Holmes and you're looking at what does this team need, they need an infusion of defensive line depth. DJ Reader is great, but if you can mix in a guy in the middle that could help out DJ Reader and keep him fresh, that'd be awesome. Maybe it's a Levi Onwuzurike. He showed some flashes. Maybe it's Mekhi Wingo. He showed some flashes early on, but just go get a guy and keep stacking the talent on D line. We heard of Brad Holmes say this before with stacking talent. This is something that Brad Holmes said about adding in all areas.
When we were at full health, I thought our pass rush was pretty good. I thought the whole defense. I think it was self-explanatory in terms of the numbers of what we were able to produce before that attrition happened. But honestly, we'll always look at all areas, and we'll always add competition at all areas. Look, you guys have seen us do it before. We drafted an inside linebacker in the first round when we had a pretty damn good linebacker room at the time. We double down that we don't really go into it with that mindset. We just try to just add the best players that we think is fit, add the best competition. Obviously, free agency will be upon us quickly. That's when you kind of can do the fun stuff of the depth chart and filling in holes on the depth chart. But after that, we'll just kind of just find the best players.
So you heard him say it right there. He's going to try to add the best players. I thought over the last couple of years, the Marcus Davenport risk didn't really work out. We all know that. John Kaminsky ended up being a plus. He was pretty good as a depth defensive end. Zadarius Smith will be here for next year. He's under contract. So it's all about getting depth, in my opinion. It ain't about getting a star. I would love Myles Garrett, but the reality of the situation is if they don't get him, it doesn't mean that they're not going to Super Bowl. It doesn't mean that they can't win the NFC. It just means that they have to go get depth. And if you looked at anything from the Eagles game yesterday, it was strictly about the depth of their defensive line and how deep it was. It wasn't just Jalen Carter. It was Milton Williams, who was a draft pick. It was guys like, Josh Sweat and guys like that. It was Brandon Graham, who came off an injury. There was no stoppage of where they were going, and they were going against a depleted offensive line in the Kansas City Chiefs, and they did a damn good job. But I'll tell you this right now, the Lions aren't far away. They match up really, really well. It's just about getting the depth for the defensive line. And when you have the injuries that you had this year, it's pretty tough to say, yeah, the depth of the defensive line would have helped because they literally went through, I think if we go back to the graphic that it had, look how many defensive linemen they lost in comparison to the whole team. They lost 9 defensive linemen. These were all guys that, besides Pat O'Connor, every one of those guys, that was 8 guys started the year with the Detroit Lions, and 8 of them missed 3 games or the whole season. So it's about staying healthy. We saw that with the Eagles. Depth is the key, and we're going to see what happens in this free agency. We're going to see what happens in a draft, but let's see what happens. But I think this Miles Garrett situation is gonna, it's gonna be something to monitor. But I think if you look at Miles Garrett, the way he's played through last year, he's a guy you should go get. 14 sacks, second in the NFL, third and fourth fumbles, tied in ninth in the NFL. But if the Detroit Lions don't get Miles Garrett, it doesn't mean that they can't compete with the Eagles, because the Eagles really showed you how you do it to keep your window open. Cheap defensive talent that you try to replicate, and you sign guys year after year after year. They got Lee McNeil. They got Aiden Hutchinson. It's about adding the depth pieces that make that defense stronger down to the back end. And that's the key, making it stronger down to the very end. Because what happened with this Detroit Lions team is at the end of the year, they had guys playing from Home Depot. That's just the reality of the situation. So we could look at the Eagles, but the Lions, they stack up well, but the issue with them is going to be adding depth, and that's going to be the key for the Detroit Lions going into this offseason, adding depth at the defensive line. If they get a star player, fine, I'm good with it. But if they can't get a guy like Miles Garrett, or they can't get a guy like Khalil Mack, fine. But let's just add more depth to that defensive line and see who's the best. And whoever's the best, they'll make the roster. Whoever's not the best, they won't make the roster. And that's what Brett Holmes said in the clip below. But we'll see you in more Detroit Lions news podcast videos on JC Sports. So stay tuned, subscribe, and like this video to get more Detroit Lions content, as well as more Detroit sports content every day here on JC Sports. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.